And now it's become time for the next session that will focus on critical perspectives, not on poetry, but on equality data and the role of combating discrimination. And this session will raise questions about how equality data can support the work against discrimination, but also risks and potential misuse of data. And first of all, I would like to introduce Edda Manga. Please, to the floor. Edda is a researcher and the head of research at the Multicultural Center in Stockholm. And her research interests revolve around the relationship between coloniality, racism, and global power structures. And I know, Edda, that you worked on a project that dwelled with a complex historical relationship between state racism and statistics and methodological problems in measuring racism to combat racism. And in relationship to this, you developed a method that is called the Ballingsholm model, and you will tell us more about this now. So let's give applause to Edda.
Yes, well, and thank you for the invitation to this wonderful conference. My presentation will take up 4 issues. The first ones, 1 and 2, are about contextualizing the demands for disaggregated data. And the third one will be about problems. And the fourth one will be about the solutions. And the problems and the solutions are related to a multidisciplinary research group that I was leading between 2017 and 2021, and who came up with this Ballingsholm model. So, according to the Swedish politician Ludvig Aspling from the Sweden Democratic Party, we don't really have huge problems with discrimination and racism in Sweden. He said this just 1 month ago, and the statement was part of his proposal to shut down the newly opened Swedish Institute for Human Rights and to stop public financing of projects concerning racism. Aspling's statement lacks empirical base. We don't have any measurement of racism at a national level in Sweden today. So we can not say it's huge or little at all. Although we have lots of research on racism indicating he's wrong, we can't really contradict him either. Because the methods, populations, and variables used in research on racism in Sweden are so diverse that it is not really possible to make any statistically valid meta-analysis which could give us a national measure that is comparable, either in time or in space. So, in this situation, it is more than understandable that anti-racist civil society organizations, transnational institutions dedicated to combat racism, and public servants working with equality issues all demand that Sweden produce national data on the impact of racism for different groups of the population. It may be that Asplund's assertions and others like that are based on a lack of knowledge. Or it may be that they are expressions of what Eduardo Bonilla Silva calls color blindness and plausible deniability. In his book, Racism Without Racists, Bonilla Silva describes 4 mechanisms, characteristics of a historical phenomenon he calls new racism. A development of the racial formation in the US after the formal elimination of statutory racism. The idea of Sweden not having huge problems with racism seemed to fit Bonilla's descriptions of the mechanisms of new racism, denial, consigning to history, color blindness, and inversing. Transnational organizations combating racism have been demanding disaggregated data collections since at least 2 decades. This has not always been the case. The history of UNESCO UN programs against racism has, for instance, shifted from dismissing racial categorization in science and politics in the 1950s to demanding racially disaggregated data collection as a tool against racism since 2001. Analyzing this history, I found interesting correlations between geopolitical changes and shifts in transnational governmentalities, which I cannot go in detail here now, but let's just say that the dismissal or renegotiation, rather, of the concept of race by expert panels in the 1950s was a response to the Holocaust, which was seen as a result of making race a central political concept of state-promoted social engineering. It was also connected to the ambitions of the US to establish a Pax Americana legitimated by democratic values, scientific progress, and economic development. Now, the demands for disaggregated data collection were formulated in another geopolitical context. It was the context of globalization and the formation of the so-called New World Order that was legitimated by human rights values. It was also a context of expansion of new liberal governmentality, which was implemented through soft policy measures. Disaggregated data was conceived to meet the need to coordinate work against racism at several levels, including national, transnational, non-governmental, and corporative. A characteristic of human rights-based governance is having a victim perspective as both epistemological and ethical principle. In the context of the boycott of world conferences against racism by countries from the global north after the Durban World Conference, demands for equality data have also become a symbolic object in the conflict around implementation of the Durban Plan of Action. The goal for the project Methodological Laboratories was to find methods able to measure the effects of structural racism for the living condition of the Swedish population at national level. And we wanted it to be comparable over time and scientifically and ethically tenable, avoiding as far as possible contributing to the reproduction of racism. And we encountered diverse problems trying to do that. I will say something about methodological problems. And we tested and analyzed and got information about many, many different kinds of methods. But here I will concentrate in the method proposed by several transnational institutions and civil rights organizations, that is, anonymous surveys based on self-identification. We found that it is not a feasible way of measuring racism in a statistically valid way, comparable over time in Sweden. To begin with, it is increasingly difficult to get people to answer to surveys. In particular, certain age groups of negatively racialized persons. Secondly, any method involving random selection from the total population will fail producing valid statistics on the living conditions of groups below a certain percentage of the population. Thirdly, self-identification does not provide a manageable number of racial categories. To get analyzable data, a survey study trying to implement self-identification must depart from the principle of self-identification, either by limiting the choices of respondents to a few racial categories defined by the collectors, or by reinterpreting the variety of responses to a few racial categories defined by the collectors. Fourthly, self-identification is not a stable and independent variable. People self-identify differently in different contexts over time, and in relation to class, demographic distribution in the particular social environment. We did this survey with school children, and they self-identified very different if the majority population of the schools they were in were white or not. So it is very variable. Also, they self-identify differently relative the status of their country of origin or their parents' country of origin in global hierarchies. Meaning, children that had French parents would say they were French, contrary to children who had Somali parents would say they were Somalis, or if they were from the working class would say, we are Muslims. So, fifthly, it is uncertain that self-identified categories are the same categories that are objects of structural racism and discrimination. And finally, in Sweden, because the population has not been trained to classify themselves in terms of race since 2 or 3 generations, self-identification would require and result in a pedagogic intervention promoting the development of racial categorization skills. And it is questionable if such a pedagogic intervention is congruent with the goal of combating racism. Now, regarding implementation, we made a study with pilots that have been done at the municipal level in Sweden with equality data. And public officials that were involved in those projects, they described that equality data collection tends to become a closed system of production of reports. There is a lack of time and competence within the organizations to interpret the data and to connect it to concrete measures conducive to the elimination of racism. So, common result is only that the box for measures against racism pass as checked once you have collected the data and nothing more happens. And in the worst cases, the data get analyzed through the lenses of the capability of analysis of the clerks. And because we live in a very racialized world, they interpret the data in a racist way. Also, there are concerns for the use of disaggregated data in the current political context. The use of equality data is dependent on the political orientation and goals of the institutions for which the knowledge is produced. In contexts where Oh, I'm sorry. In contexts where ethnic, racially defined nationalism operate, racially, ethnically disaggregated statistics are more likely interpreted and used as instruments of exclusion than of inclusion. And regarding the political use for victims or for civil society organizations, I would say that while naturalizing and stabilizing races as social and psychological phenomena may be an acceptable and even desirable outcome from the point of view of some anti-racist civil society organizations, because, of course, it opens opportunities for political mobilization, recognition, and negotiation, the political positioning as victim comes with some costs. For instance, it promotes competition between groups of victims, which ultimately may become an obstacle to the goal of effectively organizing for eliminating racism. The balanced home model was designed to solve or to circumvent some of these problems. I'm not reading it for you, so I pass next. It does that by starting the other way around, by first identify patterns of inequality in the population and afterwards analyzing the role of racism in creating those patterns. It's a Copernican turn. Balanced model is a mixed method with a quantitative part and a qualitative part. And the quantitative part conducts a multiple correspondence analysis of the whole population aged 18 to 84. So there's, by this correspondence analysis, that we identify patterns of living conditions, or if you wish, patterns of inequality. And then, in the qualitative part, we conduct bio-narrative-oriented interview study with members of the different groups found to share patterns of living conditions in the quantitative part. The model has multiple advantages and disadvantages. There is no one method to do this, of course, and there are lots of disadvantages with this method, as well as advantages. I won't be reading that either. I just will tell you the bottom line in this is that adopting a model like the balanced home model as a national periodical measurement of the effects of racism would create an empirical ground against lack of knowledge, colorblind propositions, and plausible deniability of race-based inequality in Sweden. Thank you. We wrote this book about this called Att mäta rasism. Unfortunately, it is in Swedish. Yes.
I'm gonna just... So thank you so much, Ada. I want to ask you something because you said something before that by measuring, I don't know if I interpreted you correctly, but you said that equality data risks reinforcing simplistic categories and strengthening racism.
No, you didn't hear me say that, because
No?
I don't think that.
No?
No.
No. No, but you said something else. I was trying to translate it, but is there a risk? Like, is it possible, like, by measuring racism, depending, of course, how you do it, can you reproduce stereotypes?
I think that any measurement of racism needs to disaggregate the population in different racial categories. And as far as races are social constructs, when you categorize racially, for whatever motive you do that, you are creating, you are producing a racial classification of society, and contributing to create those races. That's impossible to circumvent. The balanced home model doesn't do that either. But it does it in a way that doesn't stabilize some like predetermined racial categories for all times. Like, you know, it's not like we're which races are we going to take? You can ask, of course, different organized groups, and they would say you different things. Or you can like go back in the history of racism and think, okay, but many racial systems had 5 races, so we take them. There are black and whites and yellow and red. And what's the 5th? I don't remember. Or you do like we propose. You study the effects of structural racism first, and then you analyze how the racial formation in Sweden is at the moment of measurement. And that will give you the possibility to follow the racial formation over time.
Can I ask you something? Because you said you're not going to read it, but I know that there's people here who cannot read. So from an intersectionality point of view, I think it's quite important to actually say what was written on those slides. One thing I was thinking about, so if you think about the balanced home model, what are the advantages and disadvantages? Like, if you could just tell us a little bit on that.
The advantages that you get very, very high qualitative information about the effects for the living conditions for different groups. That is the access to housing, education, work, also capital. We have really thought about it and got many variables that make it possible for us to identify also the access to capital. And it answers to most of ECRI's and CERT's questions. So it will be possible for Sweden not to continue to answer that we can give you the statistics that you require, but we would be able to answer in an intelligent way. But the disadvantages are big. I mean, the balanced home model is very focused on structural racism. It doesn't give any statistics of interpersonal racism, like, you know, like hate crimes or violence by the police or racism in contact with institutions. It won't give you either so much information about how people are treated when they got to an institution, things like that. Because it is it uses registered data, so we are limited by what is said in registered data. But when we started this project, we were traveling and talking to many experts in equality data, like Patrick Simon in France, like Timo Makkonen in Finland. And they say, well, look, if I were Swede, I mean, you have social data to die for. So I would start there. So that's what we did.
I would like now to invite a couple of other people to the stage that are with us today. So if we could move to the other tables, we will be close to each other. And I would like to introduce two other people with a lot of expertise within this field. A warm welcome to Rosalina Latseva and Thomas Helgesson. There you are, Thomas. Rosalina is currently head of anti-racism and non-discrimination sector in the Equality, Roma and Social Rights Unit at the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights. And Thomas Helgesson is the head of section at the Statistics Sweden Authority, responsible for statistics related to living conditions and democracy, but also an expert in topics such as income and living conditions, poverty statistics, quality of life, etc. So we have two people actually you have a lot of knowledge, all of you together, on this topic. I would like to start with you, Rosalina. Can you tell me a little bit more about your work at the Fundamental Rights Agency, and how especially do you work with equality data?
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for inviting the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights to attend that very important conference. And I would like to commend also the Ombudsman and the Ombuds institution for the report today, because it's really a first step to make discrimination and all related issues visible. And if you do not make discrimination visible, you cannot address it. And that's why I start with that, what is primarily the mandate of the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights. It's an EU institution, a EU agency which is independent, and it is a center of excellence in providing evidence-based advice to EU institutions, but also to the member states in any area of fundamental rights when they implement EU law. What is FRA doing in the absence of, and the continuing lack of equality data on the national level, in particular areas of life, like discrimination in access to employment, in access to health, in health when attending health services, in housing, in education, in public and private services, or even being outside and using public transport, or being in public spaces. There is not a continuous data collection how people of different groups or different identifications, what do they experience, how do they experience their opportunities, or if they have opportunities or not. And also, not only that these areas are not regularly covered by the member states, but the groups that are most at risk are rendered invisible, even if you collect information on the general population. Since the groups are small, at the end they are not overrepresented, so they are rendered invisible even in the regular data collection of the countries like EU Silk, on living conditions of the population, where the whole social reporting and the poverty reporting is done, or the labor force surveys of the national statistical offices, also due to their limitations, how to collect that data. So FRA is asked to continue to collect such data, and since many years, since its foundation, FRA is compiling and implementing surveys on the particular groups or the particular areas, like discrimination experiences, hate-motivated crime, hate-motivated harassment, police stops, and ethnic or racial profiling. And also, not only these experiences, but we try to combine this with indicators and collecting information on the social inclusion of the groups that we are tackling. And this means to look into their social conditions and living conditions. So we ask about access, what is their employment rate, if they go to bed hungry, how often they do that, what is their material deprivation, what is their educational level, are they in training, etc., and what is the housing situation. So we try to, in order to compare information of the groups that we are covering, which are usually not visible in the national data, we try to collect information comparable to the general population that is collected by the national statistical offices, so that we can compare the gaps between the groups that we are looking at. And since, and I will finish just in a second to the first question, since many years we collect information on the Jewish population, like we are now implementing the third anti-Semitism survey, so that we can analyze trends over time. We currently just finished the analysis of data on immigrants and descendants of immigrants, the third round of that survey, and we started to prepare the second edition of Being Black in the EU report, which is going to look at the experiences of people of African descent, and this report is going to be published in November. We are just preparing the third round of the LGBTIQ survey, which is the biggest survey for the third time to be implemented this year and results next year. And we are very strong in delivering data on Roma and travelers on a regular basis. We just started the preparation for the fourth survey. And I will come back to that, how this data is used, but also looking at the general population in collecting data for the fundamental rights also of the general population, and disaggregating also this data along different diversity characteristics and inequality characteristics. And we're the agency that for the first time ever collected in 2012 a violence against women survey on the basis of 40,000 women in the EU, and currently in cooperation with the second EU agency for gender equality, IGE, we are cooperating to complement the data that countries have not collected themselves of the Eurostat survey that is looking at gender-based violence. And in 8 countries, we are collecting that additional information. We will share that then with Eurostat, but we will do a report for EU-wide on all the countries using also the Eurostat data. So, and of course, to react to ad hoc events, terrible events like the war in Ukraine, we've done an online survey on people fled the war in Ukraine in I think more than 10 member states, looking into their experiences and the implementation of the temporary protection directive. And we are planning now in 3 member states to look at experiences of women who fled the war in Ukraine, in their experiences of different forms of violence in Ukraine, on transit, and in the countries where they reside currently. And we work, of course, a lot on different other issues to collect information.
I wanted to ask you one thing, and I don't know if you could say, of course, specifically about Sweden, but Edda mentioned before that since we don't have the tradition of, identifying ourselves in races, for example, and we have the history in Sweden with race biology and everything. So how is it when you collect this in Sweden, the Swedish information? Like now I know about the survey on anti-Semitism, I got it myself. So I wonder, do you get a lot of responses from Sweden? Is it difficult? Is there a difference in which countries, because you work with all countries? How easy it is to actually get people to answer?
I think that was a very relevant challenge, but this challenge that people are tired of being researched, it is relevant for the Roma and travelers communities, it is relevant for the general population, it is relevant for any other group, that people are tired. And just examples from stories that the communities are saying, okay, you do that every 2 to 3 years, but what is changing? And that's the very substantial point. So data, to have data, it's important because you cannot show what is out there, what are the problems, but only data alone is not enough. So you need to use the data to to showcase what needs to be done. So the data is not only to show where the issues are, but also to monitor if that what you are doing in order to address that is implemented, is effective, or is it just to tick off the box. So to assess and to monitor the effective implementation of legislation is an important step, and you can't do it if you do not have data on a regular basis. So the data is not only to show where the problems are, but also to measure the effective implementation of your measures and of your policies. And you have to do it on a regular basis.
We're going to come back to that and also difficulties, but I want to ask you, Thomas, because you work at the Statistic Authority in Sweden, and I want to ask you, what do you measure and what don't you measure on a regular basis? I mean, how do we work in Sweden with this?
Yes, the Swedish discrimination grounds are similar to the European discrimination grounds. There's a difference in we don't, well, race isn't included in, it's included in ethnicity in the Swedish discrimination grounds. But since I'm working with official statistics, the law puts some limits on what we're able to actually measure and produce data on. So currently we're measuring age, sex, disability, and some other factors, but we're not able to measure ethnicity or sexual preferences. And we're using, as some other people have mentioned, proxies such as whether you're born in another country or whether your parents were born in another country, instead of information on ethnicity, for example, or race.
Can I ask you something? Because I remember I spoke with you before and you mentioned that you can measure sometimes if you get like a government assignment, you told me. So, for example, there was a government assignment on measuring the health of the Sami minority. So how did you do that if you can't record who's, I mean, if you can't like have a register for who's Sami, how do you measure this?
Yes, actually we didn't measure it. It was another government agency, but and they used registers on the Sami, I'm not sure what it's called in English, society, and also register on the people working on with the renhållning, like the animals. Mm-hmm. So they used different registers to try to cover the Sami population, and then they sent out the questionnaire to these people. It wouldn't be possible to do that with the other minority groups in Sweden, because it's not that easy to find them in different. You can't connect it to a certain occupation and so on. So it needs to be done in different ways, and also it needs to be done, as some other people have said earlier today, together with those groups of peoples. You don't. So you don't point out certain groups saying that we're measuring this group, but you need to make sure that it's okay with that group.
We're going to come back to that, but I have to ask you then, Rosalina, because I mean you're representing an agency that works in the whole of Europe, and is it possible to introduce one model that is harmonized for equality data with so many different approaches, legislations, and different minority groups and rights holders? What do you think?
I think, it is possible, maybe to a different extent. And one of the objectives of FRA is to support the European Commission, but also through that work, to support the member states to harmonize their approaches, or at least to talk the same language. So you see that even within a country, if one actor is dealing with a particular collection of data, might have their own categorization, own approaches how to collect data, and another actor would use other categories. So you need to start to understand each other. Therefore, the EU Commission, under the high-level group on non-discrimination, equality and diversity, set up that subgroup on equality data that Michaela mentioned this morning. And FRA was tasked to facilitate and to help develop work under that subgroup. And the primary task of this subgroup is to help member states to get to a harmonized way of collecting data, collecting it regularly, to understand the challenges, to talk about the different challenges, and to find way on the minimum common ground. And it is really helpful. We see effects of that work. When I started to do that work back then in 2017, 2018, there was much more challenges and misunderstanding compared to today. If you look at Ireland or look at Finland or even in Germany or Spain, other countries that, or Belgium, who started to implement these guiding principles and started their own data collection and understanding that a minimum set of comparable data across the EU is necessary, plus additionally developing the nationally necessary categories or even more data that is necessary dependent on the national context. So you can do it to some extent. It's not that you can be comparable on all the different areas, in all the different grounds, in all the different data sources. And it is important to differentiate between different data sources. And I agree with many points that Edda mentioned. However, I disagree with some points because
now it's getting fun.
Because of course, on the one hand, and I fully agree that categories have to be developed bottom up, in consultation, active consultation with communities. And I do agree that identification is not fixed. All of us. Yeah, it might today identify I'm maybe Bulgarian today, but if I'm in the US, I will say I'm European. I might be a kind of in this way or that way, a category that becomes relevant or not. So, and it is my decision how I identify. It's a voluntary decision if I provide that information, yes or no, and to which source I would like to provide that information. So if I go to a library and I'm asked about my sexual orientation, I will question what is the purpose? And why should I provide my sexual orientation for a library card? And this is one example how the collection of data could be misleading and bringing people to distrust the institution and not to provide the information. So what is important that you have the safeguards in the law and you have the safeguards in the GDPR, in the General Data Protection legislation, that you have to have a purpose, and this purpose has to be limited. But if you have a purpose like the Swedish Ombudsman to prepare a report on the state of equality, so they have to combine a lot of different information, and this information has to be provided and to be used in order to make a description about the state of equality. It's not enough to have one data. You need all the different data sources because all the different data sources have their own limitations. So it's not enough, and it's never a discussion, yes, this and only this is the method. So I do agree, in some cases you might need a colorblind approach, but in some cases you need, even in your approach, you combine a kind of, you show the inequality.
I don't see how my approach is colorblind.
No, I'm saying that, no, it's not colorblind, exactly.
It's not colorblind.
Exactly, but even if you first look at the structural dimensions of inequality, then you need the categories to describe which groups are affected more or less. Even thinking of deaths during COVID. So if you don't have an idea who is employed in which areas and who has more mortality rates or even life expectancy, if you don't ask people how they identify voluntarily on that point in time, you can never disaggregate even in relation to the right of life. And during Corona, that was explicitly important question, and we had it in UK and many other countries, that, and even in a colorblind convinced society like France, the discussion started to go other way around, that you have to make that visible. So you can't address human rights if you do not show who is really affected. And you need to do so. Otherwise, and if people do understand that this is used for their good, and Michael underlined it as well, you have a human rights-based principle how to collect and to use data. You never use the data against the groups about you, of which you're collecting that data. And then it is a kind of, I fully agree with you, Ada, that you have to look at the structural dimensions of inequality. But very often you cannot even say that it is a result of a structural racism, because you have to have complex model to analyze that. And it's not just if you have a kind of poverty rates of one group higher than the others, it's a first indication. But you have to show with an analytical approach why this is the result of a structural racism. It's not to say, okay, it's there and it is one-to-one structural racism. And then it's getting complex. Yeah. So
this poses a lot of questions, but I have to start by asking one thing then, because there is a fear. I mean, we can't ignore that fear that actually what the state collects can be used against you, right? In a time now, like increasing autocracy, declining democracies, the growth of xenophobia. How do we create this broad acceptance? Because this is important what you're pointing at. You need to have the broad acceptance of different groups that are marginalized, because if you don't have that, it will be a distrust, right? So what is your advice on that? How do we create these layers that make trust? If, for example, we live in a country where there are political suggestions using data against you. So you are the experts. Tell me, how do we do this?
Well, I'm not an expert on that subject, but because we're all working on improving the trust of official statistics every day. But but I think that there has to be a trust from the whole population, including minority groups and other groups that are discriminated against, in order to be able to publish or collect and publish reliable data.
Do you have some suggestions? Because you're both pointing out that this is an important factor. So, do you have how do we do this? Do you understand my question?
Yeah, I will start with to remind, maybe for all of you that from Sweden, they are aware of that scandal. But I will just kind of remember, together with you, the situation of the regional police register of Roma people. In Sweden, registering 4,700 people being of Roma background, or Roma, or self-identified or identified by others as Roma. At the end, this register was not a kind of known to anybody. And I think it was a kind of freedom of speech, journalists who I think at the end made that public. And this kind of to realize that people are identified as suspects just because they are Roma or their ethnic or racial background, and then they are profiled through the police, or they are put at kind of their profiles are put as risk profiles. At one moment it came and amounted to discrimination, and what is important now, because this is directly impacting on the trust of the population and the communities in the very institution of society. So it is a kind of trust in the police, trust in the judiciary, trust in policies, trust in all. So if you don't have trust, you're not going to be active citizens, and you're not going to cooperate with the police. So, and very often it is important that you cooperate with the police in order to identify risks in a particular group, in a particular area. So, but what is really, and Fra was affected through that scandal, because we were in Sweden to do the research on Roman travelers, and the communities did not trust. They say, why do you need that information? How are you going to use that information? So the communities, they need safeguards. They need safeguards in legislation. They need safeguards in the institution collecting the data. They need safeguards for the use of how the data is going to be used. And they need strong civil societies and check and balance systems. So even data published by a research institute that is misinterpreted, as you said, in a racist terms, if you have a strong research community that is interpreting the data in a different way and publishing and publicizing that, you have a competition of interpretations, and you have to allow a competition of interpretations. In the misuse case of Sweden, it was important that there was a CSO of Defenders of Fundamental Rights bringing it to the court, and following that, and at the end there was a fine. And this is important. You need a rule of law, you need effective legislation, that there is a fine, and then you have to publicize that decision in the communities to increase their trust. Second example, and I stop here, is the Netherlands. We haven't talked today about AI and algorithms. And the tax authority in the Netherlands has using for how many years profiles, risk profiles, based on AI algorithms that were primarily using ethnic or racial background or country of birth and nationality, people that have dual nationality, to identify the risk people, and also to ask them in care service to pay back an amount of, I don't know how many, it's directly affecting the life of people. So there were suicides because of that, because people could not pay the debt back that was requested by them. And at the end, now, of course, there is a kind of a regular audits and regular fines towards the Dutch tax agency because of misusing the way how they do. So you need safeguards, and you need to work to increase the trust and to clarify how the data is going to be used.
And I have to ask you, Thomas, because you do work with data, though, every day, and you know quite a lot about data. So can you tell us a little bit about, because I know you did a report on economical conditions for people with a background outside of Europe. So what were your methodological challenges doing this report, and what gains do you see with doing such a report?
We focused on people either born outside of the Europe, or if their parents were born outside of Europe. And then we analyzed their disposable income, but also wages, and looked at by using regression models. We looked at the outcomes of taking into account things such as age, sex, employment, education, and so on. And we found that, of course, age, as usual, but also employment and education had the largest effect on the outcomes of both wage and disposable income. But there's also a fact we can't measure. There's a residual that we can't measure that might be discrimination or language problems, or other factors that we're not able to use in registers.
Yes, because that's exactly what I'm trying to understand, because since I don't work with statistics and data in that way, so because there are a lot of things that you can't say with the kind of model that we're using today. The model you're suggesting, Adad, would you be able to catch many of the things we can't catch today, or what would you say?
Multiple correspondence analysis is very sensible even to small amounts of people, because what it does is to identify social nearness. So you find groups that share many similar traits, and they group with other people that also share very many traits, and so one of the challenges of statistics with small groups that only amount to few percentage of the population are not possible to take in another way, but in this case we will be able to see them. If racism has an impact on the living condition of a group, it will it will be visible in the analysis.
So this I have to ask you then, I don't know, but like for you as researchers and working with statistics, is there a minimum of number of people that have to be included in order to be able to obtain and use information? So what are the like limits when you do this?
I couldn't say a certain limit because it depends on what you're looking at. But if it's just a limit of publishing data, we sometimes have a limit of 100 persons. Sometimes it's 30, so it depends on the data you're using. When it comes to analyzing the data, I'm not sure. Perhaps you know more, but how small a group can be in order to do proper analysis and look at, for example, age, education, employment, and 10 or 20 different factors. I'm not sure.
But if you look because we've been listening both to Helena Dali today, we listened to Michaela and also you, Rosalina, and we're talking a lot about the necessity. It should be, of course, voluntary, it should be anonymous. And so, of course, my question then is in a time of far-reaching digital surveillance and everything, what is anonymity? How do we guarantee to be anonymous? What does it mean, actually? Is there a number? How do we guarantee it? Do you have just some reflections on this?
Yeah, it's a bit what I try to say, but it's a bit difficult. But it's sometimes we set a limit of 100 people. So if we split that number further down, you wouldn't be able to identify that person by, let's say, education or where you live and so on. And we try to. I had a question from a respondent as late as yesterday asking about anonymity. And of course, when you answer the questionnaire, we have to match the data with registers, and at that stage, you're not anonymous. But then when we deliver the data to researchers such as Edda, it's not identifiable at personal level. But so through the process, we kind of cut the personal identification number and so on.
Do you have some thoughts?
Just to mention that, for example, FRA is following Eurostat recommendation how to flag data that is based on small samples or small cells. That we more or less the rule that we follow at the moment is that if the distribution of a group, the final distribution is lower than 49, we have to flag it to show that it's kind of between 20 and 49, to show that this is not quite reliable if this is the case, the marginal distribution. And then if it's below 20, then we are not showing the results, similar to the way how Eurostat is also publishing in some ways. Yeah. But what is very relevant in this discussion is that what this means for the sample, when you implement a survey in a country, you need much bigger samples, because at the end, if in surveys that tackle specifically discrimination or hate crime or hate motivated harassment, because you're dealing with rare events, not all persons of a particular group, of particular gender, age group, etc., or ethnic or racial group are making these experiences. And many of the questions that you then need to ask about the perpetrator, how often, in which period. So at the end you have from the maybe 500 people, like FRA is doing, 500, which is not enough at all in a country per group. And then you have maybe out of these 500, 300, if you have a kind of that made a particular experience, or 200 that made a particular experience. And then you ask a next question, and have you reported? And to whom have you reported? And then you get less and less and less. And if you have to disaggregate that data also on age groups and education groups, etc., at the end you end up with zero. So therefore, FRA is collecting comparative data, but FRA would never make what you can do in your own countries. Therefore, we call the member states to collect and to use the statistical data. However, I don't believe that we should continue with all these equality strategies that the Commission and the EU has, to continue to say the legislation is not allowing us to collect and to disaggregate. So I'm exaggerating it, but I think now is time to say that this is not true. The GDPR is not forbidding to collect this data if you have a purpose and if you anonymize it, as you say correctly. For you, it's a bit difficult because you can kind of interlink, but for survey data, if you cooperate with the National Statistical Office, then you can do that data, anonymize it, and send it to the Ombuds institution to provide and to do their reporting. However, if you only use proxies, like, I don't know, all the black colleagues here, how are they represented in the data? If you continue to ask only country of birth and country of birth of parents, what about the third and the fourth generation? What about people of a bit different light color or Roma that also, because of their skin color, are born here, and the children, and I don't know in which generation, but they continue to be discriminated because of the skin color they have, or because they are perceived as other. It is not also, as you correctly say, it's not only about the self-identification, but how you're perceived by others.
But I would like to say something about this, because if what you need is equality data, what you need is information about inequality.
Yeah.
Am I right?
Yeah, exactly.
So if you first identify inequality and then analyze what this inequality is caused by, but it's perfect for intersectional analysis, and it is also good to understand specific forms of inequality causes like racism. You don't really need self-identification to get equality data.
Of course not. I'm not saying that. I agree fully. But even if you look at the EU SILK results, the EU survey on living conditions, you identify inequalities, poverty rate, deprivation rate, housing.
That's why you have a mixed method, because you need two, not only in quantitative.
I agree fully. No, I just wanted to elaborate. You identify where the areas of inequalities are. But then, how would you like to show which you need the disaggregation. You need people either using for disability the limitations in daily activities as the so-called Gali questions, or you have, in addition to that, people asking, do you identify as a minority in terms of disability? You have this information and other information developed through qualitative approach, the narrative, how the people understand each other. You have to combine that, but at the end, you need this information in the data to disaggregate it, to control for all the different variables, and then to say, and here you see a gap between this group and this group. And I have to say...
I don't think you need that.
May I just say one example? Life expectancy of Roma women, Roma men, and non-Roma women and non-Roma men across the EU. You have a measurement of life expectancy, and you have for Roma women 15 years gap between Roma women and non-Roma women across the EU and the countries where they're. For men, it's 9. So it is a structural indicator. And this is an information. If you don't have the information who is Roma or who is not, you can never say something about. And this is really an indication of structural inequality, I would say, no, or racism, yeah. So, or if you have the institutional, I was just gave the example with access to childcare and paying back debts, so that people are affected. So you have to show what are the backgrounds behind. Because identification of inequality we have for how many years we produce EU-SOC information?
20 years.
Exactly. 20 years. But if you want to disaggregate, it's so small that you can find people of ethnic origin. You can't find it because you don't have that information. Then you can disaggregate only about migrant background and descendants. So if you do not collect that information in these particular surveys, you can't show where the issues are. That's what I'm saying. Yeah,
Rosalina and Thomas, I have to say something. We should give them a warm round of applause. Because I'm going to be honest with you, even though we're discussing which way to do it, for me, we've come quite a far way from like 20, 30 years ago where we couldn't even discuss the fact if we were going to do this at all. So we are discussing different methods of how we should measure rather than if we should measure at all, which I think is quite important. And I think... I know we have a lot of questions, and I really would like to come back to that because you are a lot of people here with a lot of knowledge, and I want to have access to all of your smart thoughts and questions. So let's see what you have. Michelle, would you like to pose the questions, perhaps? Yeah.
Okay. Right. Yes, so we have gotten a lot of questions indeed. So unfortunately, we will not have time to go through them all. But we will start with a few questions. And the first one is to Edda. So it's since the Bellingham's model does not categorize people by ethnicity, how will we know what groups are the most exposed and affected by racism and discrimination?
Yes, as I tried to explain in the quantitative part, we just make an analysis of patterns of living conditions. So maybe we find some group that when we in the qualitative part interview chose to be people with disabilities, most of them, and we analyze that group. When we interview another group, maybe they are black people. And we analyze the interview part to see the mechanisms that create this special form of social grouping that share many living conditions, traits. So it is very important that it is a mixed method because the disaggregation actually takes part in the qualitative part. And it is also the qualitative part that can give us very, fine information about the mechanisms of racism. Not only the fact that there is this inequality, but also how it is created.
Thank you. So I have another question, and this one is for Thomas. So it goes, how does the refusal of SEBs to collect ethnic data, how does that contradict or impede the fulfillment of the government's obligations under the protection of minorities?
Good question. The thing is that if Statistics Sweden gets a commission from the government to produce such statistics, we can do it. So there are two ways that they either change the law or they give us the opportunity to produce that kind of data. That would be possible. But the third option is that European law is apparently above Swedish national law. So that could be another option.
Thank you. I'm looking at the time here, so we will have time for one other question, I believe. So this is for the panel. So it goes, races as are social categories, as are gender and disabilities. To what extent does the worries concerning racial and ethnic equality data apply even to these categories?
Well, I think that there are often comparison between equality data in gender in the study of gender inequality and race inequality. I think that the big difference is that I don't think it is imaginable that you use statistics about gender inequality to get rid of women from the country. You know, the racist use of statistics, and this is a long historical relation between population statistics and racist exclusion by the state, makes it very sensitive. But so it does with disability. We know our history, don't we?
You want to answer that as well? Yeah.
Can you repeat part of the question, please?
Sure. So it goes, races are social categories, as are genders and disabilities. To what extent does the worries concerning racial and ethnic equality data apply even to these categories?
Are you able to answer?
Yeah, a good question, and we can just underline what has been said several times. These are social categories, and even if we look now at the statistical offices, just you're my partner today, that's why I'm turning to you. But the collection of gender and sex is also changing. In some countries, like in Germany, you have a third category when you ask about sex at birth. But looking at trans people, so where are they going to identify? Are they willing to identify as a woman or as a man? Or are they preferring to have a specific trans category? Are they prefer to have a differentiation of a question that asks about sex at birth and then the current gender identity of a person? So also about these categories, we have a lot of backlash and a lot of discussion. Who is allowed to be called in the biological sex manner women, and who is not allowed to use these categories? So you're cutting the right of people to identify, even of the so-called already logical categories like gender or sex is not questioned. Is it a kind of social product? Is it or not? So why? Age. Why am I kind of identified as old or not old? Do I identify in that category or that category? So it is a social construct. And I think what is important, and the reification comes if we use these categories as essential categories, explaining that this is the only category that defines the situation of persons in a society and in hierarchical ladder, and their positioning, so that they have access only to these jobs or to that jobs and so on. Then it's an issue. However, if you do research, you start with definition. Which terms do you use and how do you define them? So if you don't want to use race, because like we can't use it very easily because you cannot translate it in some languages where even the term is not existing. However, you find like in Germany, you cannot use race, but you use racialized or treat it in racialized terms. So you have to define, do the definition, explain the construction, and then you don't have an issue because you're transparent. So you have to be transparent. What do you kind of have behind a term? When you use racial or ethnic origin, and now I make a kind of promotion in own matters and commissions matters, we have that guidance note published by Commission's website on equality data, called The Collection and Use of Equality Data Based on Racial and Ethnic Origin. And there we discuss also the problems of the definition. And there is not a one way, but you have to be transparent and to write down how you define it. And then another can come and make another definition. And it's their approach. They follow one definition. But it is a construction. It has to be discussed with the communities if a particular category, because at the end, when you go and collect the data, and if the categories do not correspond to their understanding, people are not going to fill that category. The category is going to stay empty. And then it doesn't help.
Yeah, because you don't have the trust. I have to ask one last question, and then we're going to end. Because if you would say one thing, a main thing to think about, so that actually we can work with equality data in a good way, what is the most important? You just mentioned, for example, transparency. But could you just, what is really important for us to think about?
Data has to fit into the policies and into the monitoring and developing indicators to assess the implementation of policies and legislation. And for us, data, I have to say, all the data you can find in the EU Anti-Racism Action Plan, and most importantly, what was really a great development, to develop a portfolio of indicators to monitor the implementation of the Roma framework on the national level. So you decide together with the countries, with the member states, which are the indicators that have to be monitored regularly to see if there is progress towards the objectives that are set. In the portfolio of indicators, you have first objectives and you have targets. So you have to have measurable targets. In 10 years, the level of discrimination on average has to, and the gap between those who experience discrimination and those who not, has to decrease by, I don't know, 30% or 20%. Or you have only that and that percent of people with that background that experience discrimination, or any other target. And then you need a portfolio that is agreed with the member states, and then you collect data to fill in these indicators, to kind of compile them, and then to monitor the implementation. So data is a kind of feeding in all the assessment, in all the different strategies on the EU level, but also on the national level.
Thank you. What do you think?
Well, I agree with Rosalina, what you said, but I can also add that it's important to maintain the trust in official statistics, in my case, both for the respondents of service, for example, but also the users of the statistics and some of the groups involved.
For me, the important thing is that change can come about with the use of statistics or equality data or measurement. So that will be the point of reference or the orientation. Does this work or does it not? Are there any indication that this is leading to change or not? And then there will be lots of different methods and different kind of things. Always, every method to change society has something to do with the context of power. And I'm very concerned about the radical nationalism that is awakening in Europe today. And I think that always we must keep a critical eye into which kind of practices we do and why we do them, and also analyzing the social context in which we do them.
So I want to say very much thank you to you all for this panel on critical perspectives.
Thank you.